Hello, and welcome to Transmedia Storytelling from Mythology to Marvel. My name is Jeffrey Long, and I will be your professor for this class. So let's start off with a course overview and some introductions. So first, a warning. This class is gonna go super fast, and what with it being a condensed module and everything, we're gonna have a whole lot of territory to cover in not a lot of time, which means that we're gonna move at lightning speed through this thing. It's also the case that I talk very quickly, so if at any point anything doesn't make sense, please make a note. Either email me and ask me about it, or bring it up in one of our live Zoom sessions. So yeah, with that said, buckle up and let's go. So, who am I, and what is it we're going to be doing here? My name is Jeffrey Long, and I'll be a professor of this class, like I said before. I'm a storyteller, a scholar, and a designer exploring transmedia experiences in the future of entertainment, or at least that's what I tell people when they ask me for a bio for some event or speaking thing. In reality, I am all those things, but I'm really playing with these sorts of things because I subscribe to the Ben and Jerry's philosophy of if it's not fun, why do it? I exist here. And so we, as a class, are also going to exist here at that sweet spot at the intersection of theory and practice, right? Um, I tend to believe that theory in the absence of practice tends to go floating off into the ether, but I also believe that practice in the absence of theory tends to not be as robust or intellectually informed or powerful as it could be. So that's why I view all of my projects as something that needs to be that balance between creativity and intellectual rigor. So it's that philosophy of to make is to know that informs the rest of this class. So we're going to be talking a lot about the kinds of thinking and practices that go into developing big transmedia ready story worlds like Star Wars or the Avengers. But really, what y'all are going to be doing is to be building a what's called a narrative design document. Which is sort of a blueprint for one of these big sort of worlds, which is the kind of thing that I used to do in my previous careers in the games industry, which I'll talk about here in a second. But through that process of making one of these things is where the majority of the learning in this class is going to come for all y'all. Okay, so these are my heroes, right? Umberto Eco was a semiologist, a professor and a theoretician, I suppose, that was interested primarily in semiotics, which is the study of symbols and meaning. Not only did he write a number of really profound books on that subject, but he also wrote a number of really great novels, some of which got turned into some really interesting movies. So the fact that he was able to do both theory and practice is one of those things that makes me really admire him from the intellectual side of things or the academic side of things. And then, of course, Stephen King, who is one of the most prolific horror writers and most popular fiction writers of the 20th and 21st centuries. Not only has he written, just an incredible, number of novels, but he's also taken the time to write down how his brain works when he's thinking about how to write those books. So things like Danse Macabre here is his treatise on how horror works, and his later book on writing is probably one of the best books on the art and craft of writing that I've ever read. And at this point, I've read a number of them, so that means something. So yeah, so these two are the sort of poles of my brain. But to understand where that brain came from, we kind of have to jump in the Wayback Machine. So I was born in 1977. I am exactly as old as Star Wars, and I do not see that as a coincidence. Because growing up in a day and age back in the 70s and 80s and 90s, when Hollywood had been transformed by the juggernaut that was Star Wars, and the subsequent Hollywood blockbusters that came after that, really kind of had a super formative effect on my young brain. Because I also grew up with all this stuff, right? So I grew up with the OG versions of the stuff that a bunch of y'all probably really enjoy, either enjoyed as you were kids or even enjoy now. So the original Legend of Zelda, the original Mario Brothers, the original Ninja Turtles, all this kind of stuff. That was my childhood in a nutshell. But the one that was probably the most influential as far as this transmedia stuff is concerned was Transformers. So when I was a kid, my parents both worked, which meant that I was one of those kids that had to go get babysat after school. And so my grandparents lived right down the street from my elementary school. So I would go down there a couple days a week. My mom only worked part time, so I only got babysat part time. And so while we didn't have cable, because I grew up out in the middle of the country, so we had three channels, which was ABC, NBC, and CBS, and that was it, right? Um, but Grandma and Grandpa, because they lived in town, they got cable, and so they got all the cool shows. So whenever I was, being babysat there after school, I would watch all the cartoons. So, GI Joe, Transformers, all those kinds of shows. But the problem was, because I was only babysat a couple days a week, those shows that liked to run multi-part episodes, I only got to catch part of them, right? So that meant that my own imagination was filling in those gaps. So what happened in the first part of this episode that I only got to see the second half of, or what happened, or what was going to happen in the second half of those episodes. That was a very good thing to have happen to somebody that would go on and do a bunch of storytelling. But the other thing that was really weird back in the 80s was that not only was there the Transformers cartoon, but there were also Transformers comic books. And the Transformers comic books, they were published by Marvel. And whilst both the TV show and the comic book were ostensibly licensees of Hasbro, right, the people that made the toys, there was no coordination between the two. So some character that was running around alive and happy in the TV show might have been killed off in a particular scene in the comic books. And so to my young brain, I was like, something is very strange here. And the fact that these things aren't the same means that there is some brokenness here. But it's also the case that there are certain things that are happening in one medium that couldn't really happen in another. Until the movie came out, right? So like the TV shows were pretty tame. The cartoons, nobody ever died in a Transformers cartoon, but in the movie, all bets were off, because in the movie they killed off, pretty much the entire original cast of that show. And even back then, I had some idea that, because I was like, what, 8? But I had some idea that this had something to do with Hasbro trying to get me to pester my parents and grandparents into buying me a whole new set of Transformers toys come Christmas that year. But the other thing that happened was when the dust had settled and all the blood had drained away. When the TV show picked up in the fall after the movie had played that summer, the TV show picked up where the movie left off. And I was like, wait a second, that's interesting. So the cartoon is the same world as the movie, but those two are not in the same world as the comic books. This is really interesting, right? So, like I said, even back then I had some idea that there was certain stuff you could do, like, killing off the entire cast of Transformers, that you couldn't do in a TV show, but you could do in a feature film. And that there was probably something to do with the law involved in that. There was probably something to do with, making a bunch more money off of selling more toys. That had something to do with that. So even at 8, I was like, okay, something's up. So jump back in the time machine, leap forward again. I did my undergrad at Kenyon College in Ohio, and did a whole bunch of study on the future of storytelling kind of stuff. So I was doing future storytelling, and between 96 and 2000 was really more about CD-ROMs and QuickTime videos and things like that. But after I graduated, I was still obsessed with this stuff, right? And so a couple of years later, I came across this article. And so this was a piece that ran in the MIT Technology Review. And what it describes is this guy, Henry Jenkins, who is the head of the Comparative Media Studies program there at MIT. What he was looking at was this idea of transmedia storytelling, or stories that begin in one medium and then go on into another, right? The same way that Transformers story, at least in the movies and the TV shows, started in the TV show, ran on into the movie, and then came back to the TV show. And I was like, son of a gun, this guy's actually got a term for this thing. This guy's figuring it out. And so I wound up emailing Henry. And so, I was an English major, right? And so, like, the fact that this guy was at MIT, the most tech that I knew at that point was how to make a basic website. But I figured, hey, this guy's really interesting. I might as well, talk to him. And so I just wrote him this letter. I wrote him an email and said, hey, this is really interesting. Well, what about this, this, and this? And he wrote back. And so then we struck up this conversation. We swapped emails for a while. And then that fall, they had an open house at the Comparative Media Studies program there at MIT. And I was living in Chicago at the time. And I remember it was an early snowfall that year. And I wound up jumping into this absolute janky ass, beater of a Ford Taurus I was driving back in that day. And drove from Chicago to Boston, just to go to this open house for this MIT program. And I get there, and Henry's up in the front of the room, and he's telling all these, really rock star, MIT level people about the program and about transmedia stuff. And I sat in the back row, and I was just sort of transfixed, right? I mean, it was like, being a roadie at a Grateful Dead concert. It was just like it was amazing, totally one of those like wow kind of moments. And so after the presentations were over, I went up to him and I said, hey, I don't know if you remember me or not, but my name's Jeff Long and I'm sending you emails. And he says, why didn't you tell me you were coming? I was like, well, son of a bitch. Okay, so at that point I knew I had to at least apply, right? And the next thing I knew, I got in. So I was a master's degree or a master's student in the Comparative Media Studies program there at MIT from 2005 until 2007. And while that happened, that was when Henry wrote this book called Convergence Culture, which had this whole long treatise on how transmedia worked in it as one of its chapters. And for an academic book, that particular thing really made some noise. So the industry, the entertainment industry, the media industry, all sat up and took super notice of this thing. And I was there. So I was one of the grad students that helped found this thing called the Convergence Culture Consortium, which was based on Henry's book. And so I wound up going down to Atlanta and meeting with the Adult Swim people and talking to the folks at Turner and CNN about transmedia storytelling. I did a bunch of work with a bunch of different ad agencies. I did some work with MTV. I did a bunch of work with Warner Brothers, a whole bunch of different places that were all interested in this sort of stuff. It was fantastic. So in addition to that, well, anyway, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So while I was there under Henry's guidance, I wrote this thing called Transmedia Storytelling, Business Aesthetics and Production at the Jim Henson Company. Yes, I wrote my master's thesis and got out of MIT by writing about Muppets, which is great. The main part of the main argument of this thesis, which you can read at jeffreylong.com/thesis if you're so inclined, was that there was a key difference in the pre-production processes between Labyrinth and Dark Crystal. That both of them were transmedia stories when they first came out back in the 80s. Both of them had these companion books that came out when the movies were launched, but the one for Labyrinth was radically different from the one for the Dark Crystal, and that's largely because of the amount of pre-production that went into both movies. The Dark Crystal had been in pre-production excuse me, for a couple of years, but Jim Henson and this guy named Brian Froud, who is this really fantastic sort of fantasy artist. And in the course of the pre-production for that movie, they spent all this time thinking about the world of Thra, like the map of Thra. Thra is where the Dark Crystal takes place, and the culture and the history and the language and all this world building that went into it. And versus Labyrinth, which was also done with Brian Froud, but with David Bowie, it turned into sort of this extended music video for David Bowie, right? And there was nowhere near as much time and thought put into the building of the world behind it. And the argument that I made, which actually got proved out, because keep in mind, around 2005, the Hensons had sold off the Muppets when Jim Henson died, and so they were looking for properties to resuscitate in order to stay in business. And so they went back to both of these properties in the early 2000s and revisited them with manga. And the argument that I was making, even based on that, was that the sheer amount of pre-production involved in the world building for the Dark Crystal meant that those manga books, those extensions for the Dark Crystal, made way more sense than those for Labyrinth. And I was right. There's a reason why the sequel to Labyrinth has been languishing in pre-production for years and years and years and years and years. And the TV show sequel to The Dark Crystal, Age of Resistance, prequel, I suppose, to The Dark Crystal, just had a really good run on Netflix and won all the awards. So yeah, I can talk your ears off about that later in class if you want to know. But it was great. Like this whole project actually got me a significant amount of attention. The paper actually wound up getting circulated inside of the Henson Company, which was kind of awesome. But that's another story. Like I said, I helped boot up the Convergence Culture Consortium and this thing called the Singapore MIT Gambit Game Lab, right? And so Gambit was this collaboration between MIT and the government of Singapore in order to sort of research the future of games as a medium in game development. Because Singapore really, really, really wanted to start bootstrapping a nascent games industry, right? And so while I was working with Gambit, I was looking at specifically the role of video games in transmedia stories. And so that work led to one of the weirdest conversations I've ever had. So I was, when you're involved in these kinds of research programs, what you wind up doing a bunch of is appearing on panels, like panel discussions for things, whether as a participant or as the panel chair, which is sort of the referee for the whole thing. And so I was chairing this panel on Purefold, which was this sort of a prototype for Blade Runner 2049 before Ridley Scott had the rights to actually make a Blade Runner sequel. Anyway, so really neat panel discussion. But after that, these two guys came up to me and said, "You're Jeff Long, aren't you?" And I said, "Depends on who's asking." And they said, "We're from Microsoft. And we want to talk to you about your work on transmedia storytelling." And I was like, okay, that's really interesting. Let's have a conversation. Well, the next thing I knew, I wound up consulting for this think tank, this Future of Media and Entertainment think tank for this guy, Jay Allard. And Jay Allard was the chief technical officer, chief experience officer of all of Microsoft, right? I mean, he was one of the big brains behind like the Xbox 360, and the success of that project, led to him, directly getting into the C-suite position, which was this super huge like leadership position across this mammoth company. And so I was one of this, small handful of people that was, kind of helping do thought leadership and research and development for like what the vision for Microsoft was going to be for the next 20 years. And it was awesome, right? So I got to do a whole bunch of really neat projects. Well, one of the things that I did was I helped co-write this series of 40 case studies looking at transmedia experiences across all kinds of projects and all kinds of platforms. Because the prevailing concept, or the prevailing wisdom about transmedia storytelling, especially at that point, was that it was nerd media, right? So if you're going to have a story that unfolded across multiple media platforms, it was probably going to be something like Star Wars or Star Trek, right? And it wasn't for people that weren't just nerds. And that was wrong, right? So what I was pointing out with the breadth of these studies was that as long as it was something that people were sufficiently motivated, to go and experience across multiple media, then it could very well work as a transmedia experience. So things like the 39 Clues, which was Scholastic's follow-up to Harry Potter, right? Or American Girl dolls, and the way that the American Girl stories are started in the books that go along with the dolls, but then kind of flow into these big, huge destination shopping centers. Or the Coca-Cola's Happiness Factory ad campaign, which one component of it was a movie that you could only see in the theater at the Coca-Cola Experience sort of Coke corporate theme park thing in Atlanta, Georgia, right? Or things as basically as wrestling, football, right? Music, like Coheed and Cambria's stuff, right? Coheed and Cambria built this whole story world that connected a whole bunch of their music together. As the World Turns, soap operas, yada, 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 all these different things. And what I was identifying was a sort of a core set of common elements across all of these properties that could sort of be used to form a kind of a blueprint, or a set of shared characteristics that allowed us to think about sort of transmedia as a metamedium. So in the same way that television and film are visual media, sort of like a still photograph but put in motion, right? So that's an additional affordance of video over regular still photography. Well, what I was looking at are what are the emerging affordances of transmedia as this kind of meta medium, and then how would you be able to use those insights in order to inform both the future of content creation and the future of technology, right? Those sort of technologies that you would be using in order to experience those media. So that was really what I was doing at Microsoft, and a bunch of that is what you're going to be learning how to do in this class. It was great. It was really a wicked cool sort of way to spend a couple of years. But soon after I got there, Jay Allard left the company. And so if you belong to a think tank, this really kind of crack secret team belonging to some high corporate muckety muck, and then that said corporate muckety muck leaves the company, your very employment is thrown into question. But luckily, our group was picked up by Ray Ozzie. And so Ray Ozzie was the dude that Microsoft brought in to be the new Bill Gates, right? When Bill Gates went off to cure malaria, they brought in Ray Ozzie to be sort of the new vision guy. Because Ray Ozzie was the godfather of cloud computing. He was the guy that really had that original idea to sort of distribute data and things across the internet, and then to use the internet in order to kind of pair together multiple computers across the entire thing in order to do like distributed processing as well as distributed file storage. And we can get into longer conversations about the history of the internet later. But long story short, it was Ray Ozzie that was sort of that next big vision guy. And so part of what I was doing for Ray was to start to explore this idea of, is transmedia storytelling native entertainment for the cloud? So in the same way that you have multiple computers that are connected together over the internet in cloud computing, you might see the disparate components of a transmedia story world, like different episodes of a TV show, like The Mandalorian for Star Wars, right, is connected to the feature films and things. And right now they're connected via the internet through Disney Plus. And that's interesting because if you start taking the extra information that comes along with having something be distributed over Disney Plus, then you start to learn all kinds of interesting things about the viewing habits or the preferences of the people that are watching those things on Disney Plus, because the internet is a two-way medium. It's not the same as just pushing a radio show out over the airwaves and not knowing anything about who's hearing it or what their responses are. And the other thing about the internet is you can actually change stuff from user to user based on what it is you know about them. So that was kind of what I was starting to look at, right? It's like these extra affordances of not just transmedia storytelling, but transmedia storytelling that is connected together as a digital platform using the internet. So while I was there, I was also doing a bunch of interesting work on sort of transmedia hardware. So one of the things that we did that wasn't that good was Smart Glass, right? So Smart Glass was the second screen experience where it connected together what you were watching on your phone with what you would be watching on your TV. And there were a whole bunch of people at Microsoft that were convinced that Smart Glass was the next great thing. But the problem was that they kind of failed to take into consideration the TV is designed to suck in all your attention and to make you forget the rest of the world exists. So to have a phone be chirping in the middle of an episode of Game of Thrones in order to kind of nudge you to look at a map or to get extra information about what the characters are talking about at a given point was sort of antithetical to the overall TV experience. But it was interesting. It was interesting, and it was educational. We found out a lot from that failed project. So I did that for a while, and that was really cool until Ray left the company. And by that point, I was like, okay, screw this. If you can't win the game, change the rules, right? So while I was there working in these think tanks, I had made a bunch of connections and friends across Microsoft. And so I went to this guy, Eric Nyland, who was one of the writers in the Xbox Studios writers group. And we had worked together on this transmedia pitch project for some very big names in Hollywood. And we said, what if we could create a project team, the sort of like crack special ops team that was designed just to try and prototype some of these ideas, right? To go ahead and build some of this stuff. And so we put together this proposal and we ran up the flagpole. And next thing I knew, I was working over in Microsoft Studios, and we had founded this thing called the Narrative Design Team. And the charter for the Narrative Design Team was to build like big story worlds, big transmedia-ready story worlds would unfold across Microsoft's entire entertainment platform for a decade or more, including those screens that don't exist yet, right? And that was important because that meant that we had to build worlds that could evolve in order to accommodate all kinds of weird stuff. And that gave us the opportunity to play with some really, really, really neat experimental hardware and experimental technology. But really, the point of this whole project was to build 10 more worlds the size of Halo. So I wound up spending the next couple of years after that doing pre-production on a huge number of really cool projects. Sadly, most of them will never see the light of day, but some of them that did manage to make it to market. We did a bunch of stuff for Adara, which is a launch project for the Microsoft Surface tablet. So that had tie-in novels and some other really neat stuff that built that world out. I did a project called Rise Sword of Damocles, which was a digital interactive graphic novel, which is a fancy way of saying we made a digital comic book that connected to the launch game Rise Son of Rome, which is a launch title for the Xbox One, using the exact same background or back-end technology that Fable Coin Golf used, so that we turned the comic book into a hidden object game. So when you saw like sparkly gold in the background of the panels, if you tapped on them in the comic book, it would actually unlock gold to be available for you in the game when you launched it the next time. And really, this was a prototype for just asking, how could we use that back end? Like I said, native entertainment for the cloud, right? How could we use that content or that background to take stuff that we knew about what you had experienced in a comic book and then used it to change what you would experience in the game, or vice versa. Part of what that prototype was meant to do, but we didn't actually get to do it, was to actually make the panels in the comic change based on how you had played the game. So the other thing I sort of had a loose hand in was a bunch of the work that I did at Microsoft went on to inform what 343 did with the Halo franchise moving forward. So a couple of guys from my team that I had taught a whole bunch of stuff about transmedia then went on to oversee the development of things like Forward into Dawn, which is the webisode series, or the tie-ins like Halo Cryptum, which was a series of novels, which was kind of cool in a really sort of keeping the connections going, sort of thing, because Eric Nyland, the guy that I co-founded the Narrative Design team with, really made his bones by writing the first Halo novels and doing a bunch of work on the story world of Halo when it was just an itty bitty baby game franchise. So that was super cool. I also did a ton of work on this thing called Quantum Break, which was Remedy's follow-up to Alan Wake. Quantum Break was a game that had a time travel mechanic in it. And so it's sort of a first-person shooter, action-adventure-y, Uncharted-y sort of thing, but with a kind of a Braid-level ability to rewind time. And the original vision for this was that there was a TV show that was going to launch at the same time. And based on what you played in the game, the episode of the TV show that would be streamed to you over the internet, Netflix style, to your Xbox would be different, right? And it was an amazing plan, amazing project. We shot shot all the footage. We put together the game project, but then we were yet again a little too soon, a little too early to market, and so a bunch of the stuff that we were gonna do wound up getting rendered infeasible by some, shall we say, hardware conflicts with cable set-top boxes. So instead, what wound up happening was that the Quantum Break game and TV show shipped on the same disc, and so the episodes, you can't see it, but I'm doing air quotes, these episodes of the TV show turned into these super like Metal Gear-esque long cutscenes between levels of the video game. But it was really cool, and again, we learned a bunch. The other thing that I did, the very last thing that I did there before I left Microsoft, was I did a bunch of work on HoloLens. So a whole bunch of thinking about how do you tell stories with holograms, and how do you tell stories in particular physical locations using digital overlays. And so we can have a really cool conversation about how to think about emerging media, right? So again, this gets back to that whole charter of the narrative design team to develop content for platforms that don't exist yet. This was one of the things we were thinking about on holograms. And I did a whole bunch of other stuff that sadly I cannot tell you about because NDAs are uh, horrible things. Anyway, so did that for a couple of years, and that was super fun. But you'll notice that I keep saying we did all this stuff and then it didn't see the light of day, or we did all this stuff and then it didn't get to ship. We did all this stuff and then like some corporate thing went awry. You can only do that for so long before sort of it kind of breaks your heart. So after a couple of years of that, I decided, I gotta go back to school. And so I left Microsoft Studios and I called up Henry and I said, "Hey Henry, what's going on? What are you working on?" And he says, "Well, I've left MIT and I went down to USC, there in Los Angeles." And I was like, "Great, I'll be right down." So my wife and I left Microsoft and we packed our bags and we moved down to Los Angeles, and I became first the technical director and then the creative director for this thing called the USC Annenberg Innovation Lab in USC's Annenberg School of Communications and Journalism, which it was called a think and do tank, right? So we were working with big Hollywood partners and big journalism partners and big tech partners in order to explore kind of the same stuff I've always looked at, right? Future of media and entertainment. So we did a bunch of neat stuff for, DirecTV. We did a bunch of really neat stuff for Fox, and we did a bunch of really neat stuff for the city of Los Angeles, looking at this like a smart city as a storytelling platform. And we did a bunch of neat stuff with IBM using Watson, their artificial intelligence, natural language processing beastie. And so it was a really fun way to spend a bit of time. Most of what I was focusing on there was looking at this, what we call the new screens. So things like augmented reality, virtual reality, but also how do you tell stories of things like 3D printers, right? That was a lot of fun. I was also looking at the new creators and makers, which is one of the things that I learned at Microsoft is that we might perceive companies like Microsoft and Disney as the only place that innovation can happen, because only places like that have the money and the really deep pockets to throw at developing these kind of experiments. But in reality, the fact that they are publicly traded companies means that they're also intensely risk averse, which means that most of the really interesting stuff is only going to happen by indies, and the rise of things like the internet that give people an opportunity to make a living independently using, YouTube and Amazon Kindle and stuff like that. Meant that there was a whole lot of really interesting stuff happening in that space. And so I was observing a series of best practices that are emerging there too, for how people that are maybe not getting rich, but at least having very comfortable livings on YouTube and Twitch and things like that, had a bunch of stuff in common with people that were making a good living selling ebooks on Kindle and so on and so forth. So if you're interested in that particular direction, I have another class that I'm teaching in the spring, which is Digital Storytelling on the World Wide Web, which is really the Storyteller as a startup class. So if you're interested in becoming a internet personality and selling your stuff online, that would be a good class for you to take too. So I did that for a while, and then jumped over to the School of Cinematic Arts, right? USC's big famous film school. Both to become the creative director for this thing called the World Building Media Lab, which was the brainchild of this guy Alex McDowell, and also to finish up my PhD in this program called Media Arts and Practices. So the World Building Media Lab, like I said, brainchild Alex McDowell. Alex, it was a production designer, right? So he would design the production, which I know is a tautology. But he was a production designer is the guy that's responsible for how an entire movie looks, right? So what the world looks like, feels like. They're basically responsible for everything that appears on the screen that doesn't necessarily appear in the script. So if the script is sort of the blueprint for how a film is going to get put together, a production designer is the person that comes in and fills in all the details. Right. So he did a bunch of really awesome stuff for Fight Club, Man of Steel, but most importantly for this class, and we'll come back to this a bunch of times, is Minority Report. Through Minority Report, Alex developed this methodology of sort of asking what your central deviation from reality is. So what's your first what if? And then once that what if is established, then you then ask, then what, and so what? is the kind of the ending, pinnacle of that line of reasoning. And so Alex would bring in a whole bunch of subject matter experts from all over the industry in order to help make those worlds on film feel very, very real. And the side effect of that was that a bunch of the thought that went into developing worlds for films like Minority Report then turned into real world projects. So we can talk more about that soon. But in the lab, we wound up building a whole bunch of really neat world experimental projects. So Dry City 2035, imagine a future for Lagos, Nigeria, in which drinkable water had been privatized. Wonder Buffalo was a we got nominated for a technical Emmy for this one. It used photogrammetry, which is sort of a virtual reality technology in which you don't necessarily render the world out in a game engine, but you use film footage and like real realistic footage of everything from multiple angles in order to make it feel like you're really moving around inside of a movie. The World in a Cell, which is that weird looking thing on the upper right, with that kind of Christmas tree thing in the middle, that's actually meant to represent a human pancreatic beta cell. So we were working with the medical school there at USC, and coupled with a bunch of people from the city of Los Angeles that were looking at smart cities. And we were trying to identify what the sort of common elements between cancer research. So pancreatic beta cells are the ones that really deal with pancreatic cancer, right? And so if you look at the way that the human body deals with incursions of things like cancer cells and the way that it fights off cancer and the way that particular drugs work to fight off cancer, there's actually an interesting amount of overlap between that and the way that emergent autonomous vehicle systems have to work in order to have both smart cars and human-driven cars moving around inside something like the city of Los Angeles. So what we were looking at were how could we inform new cancer drugs by looking at smart cars, and how could we make better smart cars by looking at the way that the human body tackled cancer. And finally, the last thing that we did, I guess one of the first things that we did when I first got there, this thing in the lower right was called the Leviathan Project. And what they did was they took you guys have seen those motion capture pajamas. They're covered in the white dots. So we ripped all the dots off the pajamas, and we set this thing up in this big mocap stage. But we put the dots on the little gloves that you would wear when you were wearing like first generation Oculus Rift and other virtual reality headsets. And then we put a bunch of the dots on these objects that would surround the user. And so those objects would map perfectly into these game objects so that the user would, in virtual reality, walk into this lab space that was in this giant flying whale based on Scott Westerfeld's Leviathan books. And they were asked to go through this process of, using the lab in order to make this new flying creature. And they would say, go throw this particular switch. And when the user, put their hand out, because they were using motion capture to map the physical object perfectly onto the digital objects, when they put their hand down on the virtual switch, there was an actual real world switch there for them to throw. And so they would move that thing in the real world, and what would happen in the game would map perfectly onto that. So it actually became a fully immersive physical interface for a virtual reality experience, which at that time was one of the first times that had ever been done. So that got us some noise too. That was really fun. Anyway, so I finished my PhD there in 2018. Yeah, this has just been a couple years. And so I became Dr. Long there, and I wrote my doctoral thesis as sort of the culmination of all this work in transmedia storytelling. So this class is really me walking y'all through the same process that I work a bunch of my consulting clients through, and I'm going to be teaching you the exact same tricks and tools and techniques that I've learned in building transmedia ready story worlds here over the course of this entire career. Some of the other weird things that I have done, and then like right when I was finishing up my PhD, I came over to become a visiting assistant professor at Whittier, and I've kind of been here ever since. And then I also have launched my own independent consulting and IP development company called Mystery Barn, which, with a little luck, the first project out of the Mystery Barn will sort of emerge late this year, but we'll see. But I will give you a little bit of secret insight into some of the weirder things that I've been working on. one of my big consulting gigs here last year was I've been doing a bunch of work with Walt Disney Imagineering, thinking through. Remember what I was saying before about when you start looking at holograms and virtual reality and augmented reality, all that stuff requires you to think about space as a storytelling medium and to think about the actual room around you as a kind of platform for story. And nowhere is that kind of thinking more evident than in theme park design. And so Walt Disney Imagineering has been doing a bunch of work on this thing called Galactic Star Cruiser, which is the Star Wars hotel down in Florida, which, COVID willing, will launch and do all kinds of awesome things. And I'm really hoping to God that COVID does not totally, strangle that project in the cradle, so to speak, because the stuff that we were building that will take the form of this sort of like multi-day immersive theater experience in a hotel is like nothing else that exists on Earth. And so that was a really wicked cool project, and I cannot wait to tell you more about it as soon as it actually launches and people can see stuff and I'm not violating NDAs. The other thing I'm doing right now, which is also under super NDA, is I'm doing a bunch of consulting for Amazon Studios. So as Amazon is thinking through what it means to move into original content for their streaming services, what the unique opportunities are for a company the size of Amazon with the kind of reach as Amazon has across things like hardware, software, e-commerce, subscription platforms, and so on and so forth. So how do you start thinking about that as a storytelling platform? So yeah, that's been really, really interesting. So, getting back to this question of what are you guys doing here and what am I doing here as your teacher, all of this stuff that your guys are going to be experiencing in this module is really the art of narrative design. So, going back to that principle, to the underlying principles of the narrative design team at Microsoft Studios, if you think about design as the art of solving problems, right? So a designer looks at a particular project and they take into consideration who the end user is, and then they ask themselves, what is the problem that user has? What is it that the user really wants? And then how can we design something, this product, this service, whatever it is, that creates a really excellent experience for that particular user? And so in the course of a transmedia story, or the development of a vast franchise like the Marvel Cinematic Universe is a thing that is very explicitly designed, right? So that's what we're going to be doing. Is I'm going to be teaching you how to think about how stories that are told in transmedia stories are different from a story that is just told in one particular medium, how to work through this process of world-centric narrative design, right? So how to build a world like we did in the World Building Media Lab, or the way that we build a world for something like Halo, and then to explore that world with the characters that you develop, and you marry those kinds of stories and character opportunities with particular media, like what kind of part of the story is best told in a video game, or what part of the story is best told in a comic book, or what part of the story is best told in a TV show, right? Why is The Mandalorian better as a TV show than a feature film? Well, we can talk about that. And by using these kinds of tips and tricks, you're also able to think critically and creatively about those media that don't exist yet, the same way that I had to do for HoloLens, or the same way that I was doing for Imagineering. I'm going to teach you a bit about how to do that, right? So hopefully with all these kinds of tips and tricks in your pockets, you can go out and really make a difference in the future of media and entertainment. And so that's what we're going to be doing. You all are going to be splitting up into teams because there's just too many of you for me to do grading at the scale of the projects you're going to be building, individually. But you all will be doing individual contributions to these overall projects, because each team is going to be making a world, and then each team is also going to be responsible for producing some prototype media that comes out of that world. But the big deliverable that's going to come out of this class is this narrative design document. And a narrative design document is this giant blueprint that is sort of one half of a game design doc, like you might produce for a giant video game, and one half of a story Bible that you might produce for a TV show, right? And you will find samples of those there's the if you go on the Moodle at the very tip top, there's a sample narrative design doc that I've written for a project called Spook Show, and that narrative design doc is an example of what happens, or an example of a fully fleshed out narrative design doc. Do not crap your pants. The kind of things that you're going to be developing over the course of this semester do not have to be that in depth. I'm not expecting you to do this, especially over the course of 7 weeks, but you will be producing something that's sort of the minimum viable prototype version of that document. Yeah, and so we can talk more about that when we meet up tomorrow on Tuesday. So thank you so much for listening, and I will see you soon.